The air in this wing of the estate doesn't move. It waits, like a predator holding its breath in a room made of glass and cold marble. I am standing before a mirror that costs more than the house I grew up in, but the woman staring back at me is a stranger, a polished shell of a human being whose eyes have been emptied of everything but fear. I am holding a small, silver engraving tool I found in the restoration room, a tool meant for cold metal, yet tonight, it is the only thing keeping me grounded as I prepare to reveal the rot hidden beneath this billionaire's paradise. My name is Janet, and for 3,650 days, I have lived as a phantom in my own life, stripped of my humanity and assigned a chilling digital identity that stripped away my name and replaced it with a cold, hard fact. I was merely item number 7, the latest acquisition in a collection that doesn't allow for mistakes. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heartwarming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. And drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable, happy listening. It began with a proposal that felt like a coronation, a whirlwind of private jets and promises from Elias Thorne, a man whose wealth was so vast it felt like a force of nature. But the night we returned from our honeymoon, the atmosphere shifted. He didn't carry me over the threshold. He led me into a high-security vault room and presented me with a delicate platinum bracelet that had no clasp. It was welded onto my wrist in a silent ceremony of ownership. On the inner band, visible only to me, were the digits, 7. I laughed then, thinking it was a high society joke, a playful nod to a spy movie, but the look in Elia's eyes stopped the breath in my lungs. There was no humor there, only the cold satisfaction of a curator who had finally found the missing piece for a very specific display. From that hour on, my life became a series of programmed movements. I was told when to smile, which vintage of wine to hold without drinking, and exactly how many degrees to tilt my head when his guests arrived to admire his acquisitions. I wasn't a wife. I was a living exhibit, a ghost haunting a house of gold, until I accidentally tripped a silent alarm in the basement library and discovered the archive. A room filled with the personal belongings of 6 women who came before me, each box labeled with a serial number, and each box ending with a death certificate signed by the same private doctor. The basement of the Thorne estate doesn't smell like a cellar. It smells like a hospital, sterile, cold, and stripped of any scent of life. As I stood in that hidden archive, my fingers trembling against the cold steel of the filing cabinets, I realized that the man I married didn't just want a companion. He wanted a legacy of perfection that could be filed away when it started to show the wear of time. Each box in that room was a testament to a life that had been systematically erased. I opened the first crate labeled item number 1 and found a simple silk scarf, a pair of worn ballet slippers, and a birth certificate for a woman named Clara. She was only 24 when she disappeared into this house of shadows. There were no photographs of her laughing or living, only technical diagrams of her facial structure and notes from Elia's private surgeons on how to enhance her features to match his ideal. I felt a cold sweat prickle my skin as I realized these women weren't just predecessors, they were prototypes. I moved from box to box, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. By the time I reached item number 6, the pattern was undeniable. Each woman had been carefully selected for a specific trait, one for her eyes, one for her grace, one for her voice, and each had been discarded the moment they dared to age, to cry, or to scream against the gilded bars of their cage. I remember the way Elias would sit in his leather armchair in the evening, swirling a glass of amber liquid, watching me as I stood by the fireplace. He would often tell me that I was his masterpiece, but standing in that basement, I finally understood the terrifying weight of that word. A masterpiece is finished. It doesn't change, it doesn't grow, and it certainly doesn't have a will of its own. To Elias, a wife with a heartbeat was a liability, a flaw in the design. I found a leather-bound journal in the back of the room, tucked away as if it were a shameful secret. It belonged to Sarah, item number 5. Her handwriting started off elegant and strong, but by the final pages, it was a jagged mess of desperate pleas. She wrote about the sessions in the West Wing, the injections that made her limbs feel like lead, and the way Elias would talk to her as if she were already a statue. "He is trying to stop time," she had scrawled in a frantic hand. "He doesn't want a wife, he wants a monument to his own power, and once the monument is built, the foundation is buried." I heard a faint click from the heavy steel door behind me, the sound of the electronic lock engaging. My breath hitched. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to know that I was just the latest coat of paint on a wall that was built over a graveyard of broken women. The heavy thud of the steel door locking was not just a sound, it was a sentence, a final confirmation that the walls of this mansion were designed to keep the world out and the secrets in. I stood paralyzed in the center of that sterile archive, the journal of item number 5 still clutched in my trembling hands, listening to the hum of the ventilation system that recycled the same dead air over and over. Every shadow in the corner of the room seemed to stretch toward me, taking the shape of the 6 women who had stood where I was standing, clutching the same evidence of their own approaching end. My mind raced back to the wellness treatments Elias insisted upon every Tuesday afternoon, the sessions where a silent, masked doctor would enter my suite with a tray of silver vials and a gaze that never met my eyes. I had always been told they were vitamin infusions to maintain my radiance, but as I looked at the medical records scattered on the desk, the truth was far more sinister. They were chemical restraints, a slow-acting sedative designed to dull my reactions, to keep my expressions neutral, and to ensure that my pulse never quickened with the fire of rebellion. I was being slowly turned into a living doll, a biological sculpture that breathed only because Elias allowed it. I found a detailed blueprint of the mansion's west wing, a section I was strictly forbidden from entering, labeled the preservation suite. It wasn't a guest wing. It was a high-tech taxidermy lab for the living. The diagrams showed specialized cooling systems and display cases equipped with biometric sensors, glass boxes designed to hold a human form in a state of suspended animation. Elias wasn't waiting for me to grow old. He was preparing the case for my final rest. He didn't want a partner to walk beside him. He wanted a trophy to remain forever 29, frozen at the peak of the beauty he had purchased. I realized then that my serial number wasn't just a designation for the household staff. It was a placeholder for a grave that had already been dug. I heard the distant, rhythmic tap of leather shoes on the marble floor above. Elias was home early. The sound was methodical, arrogant, and getting closer to the hidden staircase. If he found me here, with the records of his crimes spread out like a feast of betrayal, I wouldn't just be decommissioned. I would be erased before the sun touched the horizon. I scrambled to shove the journal under my coat, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure he could hear it through the floorboards as I searched frantically for another way out of the tomb of the Thorn Wives. The rhythmic tapping of Elia's shoes grew louder, echoing through the vents like the ticking of a countdown clock, each step vibrating in my very marrow. I stood frozen, my back pressed against the cold metal of the archive shelves, the stolen journal of item number 5 feeling like a block of ice against my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but in this house, running was an admission of guilt, and Elias Thorne did not forgive those who looked behind the curtain of his carefully constructed reality. I scanned the dim room, my eyes landing on a small service elevator used for transporting deliveries to the upper galleries, a narrow, dark shaft that smelled of machine oil and old dust. I slipped inside just as the heavy archive door groaned open, the hiss of the pneumatic seal sounding like a snake ready to strike. Through the tiny gap in the elevator door, I saw his shadow spill across the floor, long, distorted, and predatory. He didn't rush, he walked with the terrifying confidence of a man who owned the air I breathed. I watched, my breath held until my lungs burned, as he approached the desk where I had left a single medical file slightly out of place. He paused, his gloved hand hovering over the paper, and for a heartbeat, the world stopped spinning. He knew. He could smell the fear I had left behind in the room. He slowly turned his head toward the service elevator, his eyes hidden behind those reflective glasses that never allowed me to see the man inside, only the monster who wore his skin. I pulled the manual lever, and the lift jolted downward into the bowels of the mansion, into a service tunnel that wasn't on any map Elias had ever shown me. The tunnel was damp and lined with thick, pulsing cables that hummed with a low-frequency vibration, a hidden nervous system for the estate's dark secrets. As I stumbled through the darkness, my hands brushing against wet stone, I realized that the preservation suite wasn't just a room. It was the heart of the house, and I was walking directly into its mouth. I found myself in a corridor lined with heavy, reinforced glass panels, and as I pressed my face against the cold surface, my scream was trapped in my throat. It wasn't equipment I saw inside, it was a wardrobe of ghosts. 6 mannequins stood in the center of the room, each wearing the exact wedding dress of the wives who came before me, but as the motion sensor lights flickered on, I saw the horror. They weren't mannequins. They were the physical remains of the women, preserved in a terrifying, lifelike state of perfection, their skin shimmering with a synthetic coating that made them look like porcelain. And in the very center of the room stood a 7th pedestal, empty and waiting, bathed in a soft, golden spotlight that felt like a death warrant. The light hitting that empty pedestal wasn't warm. It was the surgical, judging glow of a spotlight waiting for its final act. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed off the reinforced glass, staring at the collection that Elias had built with the blood and youth of 6 innocent women. To my left stood item number 3, her hands folded over a bouquet of dried roses, her face frozen in a terrifyingly perfect smile that reached nowhere near her glassy, preserved eyes. To my right was item number 5, Sarah, the woman whose journal I still held against my heart. Seeing her there, turned into a decorative object for a monster's amusement, made the reality of my own fate crash down on me like a tidal wave of ice. I wasn't just a wife who was losing her husband's love. I was a piece of raw material being processed for a permanent display. I realized then that the vitamin infusions were more than just sedatives. They were the first stage of the preservation process, a chemical cocktail designed to petrify my tissues from the inside out while I was still drawing breath. Elias didn't want to kill me, he wanted to stop me. He wanted to capture the exact moment of my greatest beauty and hold it captive for eternity, indifferent to the fact that the soul inside would be screaming in a silent, paralyzed hell. I heard a low, mechanical hum as the platform beneath the empty pedestal began to rotate, a pre-programmed sequence sensing my presence in the room. A digital display at the base flickered to life, glowing with a cold blue light that read, Item number 7, Janet. Status, preparation phase 80%, finalization imminent. My knees buckled. I had been living my life on a timer I couldn't see, and the clock was seconds away from striking midnight. Every diamond he gave me, every dress he bought, every romantic dinner we shared was just a fitting for this glass coffin. I looked at the security camera in the corner of the ceiling and saw the red tally light blink on. He was watching. He wasn't in the archive anymore. He was in his control room, savoring the moment his masterpiece finally understood her purpose. The speakers in the ceiling crackled with a soft, distorted static before his voice drifted down, smooth as silk and cold as a grave. Don't be afraid, Janet, he whispered, the sound wrapping around my throat like a noose. Transformation is always painful, but once it is done, you will never have to feel pain or age or fear ever again. You will be perfect. You will be mine forever. I scrambled toward the back exit, my fingers clawing at the smooth glass, knowing that if I didn't find a way to break this cycle of madness, I would become the seventh ghost in Elias Thorne's silent, beautiful nightmare. The sound of his voice through the speakers was like a physical weight, pushing me down into the cold floor of that glass-walled nightmare. Elias didn't view my terror as a tragedy. To him, it was just the final ripple on a lake before the water turned to ice. I scrambled away from the pedestal, my heels clicking frantically against the polished stone, searching for a seam in the glass or a flaw in the security of this high-tech tomb. The chamber was designed with a cruel elegance. There were no visible handles, no switches, only the seamless integration of technology and terror. I realized that every gift he had given me, the biometric watch that tracked my heart rate, the smart jewelry that mapped my location, were actually the very tools he was using to monitor my readiness for the collection. My heart was racing so fast now that the watch on my wrist began to pulse with a steady, angry red light, signaling to the system that my vitals were peaking. On the wall-mounted monitors, I saw a graph of my own life force, a jagged line that Elias was watching from his sanctuary, waiting for the perfect moment of maximum distress to trigger the final sedation. He wanted my face frozen in this exact expression of exquisite horror, a permanent monument to the moment I realized I was owned. I grabbed a heavy bronze bust of a nameless Greek god from a nearby display stand, my muscles screaming with the effort, and hurled it with every ounce of my remaining strength against the reinforced glass. The sound was deafening, a bone-jarring crack that echoed like a gunshot, but the glass didn't shatter. It only spiderwebbed, a mocking reminder that I was trapped in a cage built by a man who anticipated every move of his prey. I fell to my knees, the stolen journal of item number 5 slipping from my coat and sprawling open on the floor. My eyes landed on the final, frantic entry Sarah had written, "The air changes before the end. It smells like ozone and bitter almonds. If you smell the almonds, the mist is coming." At that exact moment, a soft, rhythmic hiss began to emanate from the ceiling vents. A fine silver mist began to curl downward, beautiful and deadly, carrying the sharp, sweet scent of bitter almonds. The room began to spin, the edges of my vision fraying into a dull, heavy gray. I crawled toward the cracked glass, my fingers bleeding as I clawed at the fractures, knowing that once this mist filled my lungs, Janet would die and item number 7 would be born. The silver mist didn't just fill the room. It seemed to inhabit my very thoughts, turning my memories into heavy, sluggish shadows that refused to move. Every breath felt like inhaling liquid lead, the sweet scent of bitter almonds coating the inside of my throat until I could no longer taste my own fear. I watched through the haze as the spider-webbed cracks I had made in the glass began to shimmer, the light from the spotlights bending through the fractures like 1,000 jagged knives. My fingers, slick with the blood from the glass, began to lose their feeling, turning into cold, unmoving marble even as I watched them. I looked up at the camera, my vision blurring, and saw the red light pulse in time with my failing heart. Elias was not just a spectator. He was the conductor of this final symphony, orchestrating the exact second my autonomy would cease to exist. I realized then that the archive of the previous wives wasn't meant to be hidden forever. It was meant to be found. He wanted each of us to reach this moment of total realization, to feel the crushing weight of our own insignificance before we were locked away. The terror was the final ingredient, the spark that gave the collection its haunting, lifelike quality. I felt a sudden, sharp vibration on my wrist. The biometric watch was emitting a high-pitched whine, a signal that my body was reaching the optimal state for preservation. With a desperate animal strength I didn't know I possessed, I jammed the corner of the heavy bronze bust into the largest crack in the glass and leaned my entire body weight against it. The sound of the glass finally giving way wasn't a shatter. It was a deep, guttural groan of defeated metal and reinforced polymers. A single, narrow opening appeared, and the pressure difference caused the silver mist to be sucked outward into the hallway. I collapsed through the jagged hole, the glass tearing through my expensive silk dress and marking my skin with the truth of my escape. I lay on the cold stone of the corridor, my lungs burning as they fought for clean air, listening to the alarm system begin to wail a low, mournful tone throughout the estate. I wasn't free yet, but the perfect image Elias had cultivated for item number 7 was now broken, bleeding, and crawling through the dark. I grabbed the silver engraving tool from the floor, the only weapon I had against a billionaire's empire, and began to drag myself toward the service tunnel, knowing that the curator was already on his way to reclaim his damaged property. The alarm wasn't a loud, piercing siren. It was a low-frequency throb that I felt in my teeth, a rhythmic pulse that told the entire house the collection had been breached. I dragged my body through the jagged gap in the glass, the raw edges of the frame biting into my shoulder, but I felt no pain, only the freezing adrenaline of a woman who has seen her own grave and refused to lie down in it. The silver mist trailed behind me like a dying ghost, losing its lethality in the vast, open space of the service corridor. I looked back at the preservation suite and saw the red emergency lights reflecting off the porcelain skin of the other wives, their frozen eyes seeming to watch me with a silent, desperate hope. I was the first one to ever break the glass. I was the first one to bleed. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking like a newborn's, and followed the thick, black cables that lined the floor. These cables were the umbilical cords of the estate, carrying power to the sensors, the cameras, and the chemical vats that kept the items in their horrific state of perfection. If I could follow them to the source, I could find the heart of the machine, the control room where Elias sat like a god, playing with lives as if they were chess pieces. The tunnel narrowed, the walls changing from finished stone to raw, damp concrete, and the air began to grow hot and heavy with the smell of ozone. I reached a heavy iron grate that looked out over the main engine room, and there he was. Elias wasn't sitting behind a desk. He was standing in front of a wall of monitors, his back to me, silhouetted against the glow of 100 screens displaying every corner of my private life. He was watching the footage of me breaking the glass over and over, his hand moving in a slow, rhythmic motion as if he were stroking a canvas. He wasn't angry that I had escaped the room. He was fascinated by the raw emotion I was showing. Exquisite, I heard him murmur, his voice vibrating through the grate, the way the light catches the blood on the 7th. It adds a layer of reality I hadn't anticipated. I realized then that my struggle wasn't an escape to him. It was an audition for a more violent, more authentic display. He had no intention of letting me leave the grounds. He was just waiting for me to exhaust myself so he could collect the most dramatic version of my corpse. I gripped the silver engraving tool until my knuckles turned white, realizing that to survive, I couldn't just run from the curator. I had to destroy the gallery. The heat in the engine room was a physical wall, thick with the scent of scorched copper and the relentless hum of high-voltage transformers. I stood behind the iron grate, watching Elias admire my suffering on his wall of screens, and a cold, sharp clarity washed over me. He didn't see a woman, he saw an investment, a piece of interactive art that was currently performing its most exciting act. I looked down at the massive cooling pipes that snaked beneath his feet, carrying the liquid nitrogen and chemical preservatives to the preservation suite above. These pipes were the only thing keeping the collection from turning into a room of rotting tragedy. If I cut the circulation, the masks would slip, and the beauty Elias worshipped would vanish into the reality of death. I moved silently along the catwalk, my bare feet making no sound on the metal mesh, until I reached the main valve manifold. The silver engraving tool was small, but I didn't need a sledgehammer. I just needed to bridge the gap between two exposed high-tension wires I saw sparking near the coolant regulator. My heart was a drum in my chest, beating a rhythm of defiance against the man who had stolen my name. I reached out, my hand hovering over the sparking wires, knowing that the surge would likely throw me back and alert him to my exact position. but as I looked at the monitor showing the empty seventh pedestal, I knew I would rather be a memory of fire than a statue of ice. I jammed the tool into the electrical housing, and the world exploded in a shower of blue sparks and the deafening shriek of metal under pressure. The lights in the engine room flickered and died, plunged into a terrifying velvet darkness broken only by the red emergency strobes. I heard Elias scream, not in fear for his life, but in a panicked, guttural rage for his work. "No, the stabilizers. Janet, what have you done?" he roared, his voice stripped of its silk and revealed as the jagged blade it truly was. I didn't answer. I dropped from the catwalk into the shadows of the lower level, feeling the vibration of the floor as the cooling systems began to fail. The low hum of the house was replaced by the sound of gurgling chemicals and the hissing of steam. The machine was breaking, and for the first time in 10 years, the ghost was the one in control of the gears. I began to run through the darkness, following the smell of the damp earth from the service tunnel, knowing that Elias was no longer a curator. He was a man losing his grip on a crumbling dream, and a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous predator of all. The darkness of the engine room was alive with the sound of a dying empire, a symphony of shattering glass and the roar of escaping steam that drowned out the frantic alarms. I could hear Elia's heavy footsteps above me, the once calculated rhythm now replaced by a chaotic, stumbling gait as he lunged toward the manual overrides. But it was too late. The surge had triggered a chain reaction that was eating through the mansion's nervous system, turning his high-tech sanctuary into a furnace of failing dreams. I pressed myself into a narrow crevice between the vibrating walls, the heat from the ruptured coolant pipes blistering the air, yet I felt a strange, cold satisfaction. Above us in the preservation suite, the climate-controlled silence was being replaced by the sound of ice cracking. The artificial chill that held the other wives in their porcelain state was vanishing, and the reality of time was finally catching up to them. I knew that within minutes, the beauty he had stolen would begin to soften, to fade, and to rot, proving that no amount of money can freeze a soul forever. I peeked through the shadows and saw Elia's face illuminated by the flickering red strobe light. He looked like a demon losing his throne, his eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on a monitor that was showing nothing but static. He began to claw at the control panel, his expensive suit tearing at the seams, a man reduced to a panicked animal as his item number 7 became the very force that would dismantle him. I realized then that my escape wasn't just about leaving the grounds, it was about forcing him to look at the wreckage of his own obsession. I found a heavy steel door marked emergency manual release, and with a strength born of a decade of suppressed rage, I threw my weight against the lever. The door groaned and swung outward, revealing a narrow staircase that led not to the gallery, but to the private office behind his bedroom, the inner sanctum where he kept the gold keys to every cage he had built. As I ascended the stairs, I could hear him screaming my name, a sound that carried no love, only the possessive fury of a collector who had lost his prize. I wasn't running away anymore. I was moving toward the evidence I needed to ensure that when the sun rose, the world would see Elias Thorne not as a billionaire philanthropist, but as the architect of a gilded graveyard. I reached the top of the stairs and stepped into his office, the air smelling of old paper and expensive tobacco, and there, sitting on his mahogany desk, was the final ledger, the one that contained the real names of the 6 ghosts and the address of the laboratory where the 7th cage was currently being manufactured. The office was a fortress of silence, a stark contrast to the mechanical chaos screaming in the floors below. I stood over the mahogany desk, my shadow cast long and distorted by the flickering red emergency lights, looking down at the heavy, leather-bound ledger that held the weight of 7 ruined lives. My hands, stained with the dust of the service tunnels and the blood from the glass, hovered over the cover before I gripped it and pulled it toward me. This wasn't just a book of accounts, it was a catalog of human souls. As I turned the first page, I saw Clara's face, item number 1, not the frozen porcelain version I had seen in the vault, but a real photograph clipped to the corner. She was laughing in a garden, her hair messy and her eyes full of light. Beneath her photo were the cold, clinical notes Elias had written. Initial acquisition. Subject shows excessive emotional variance. Resistance to stillness noted. Corrective sedation required. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized he had documented the slow breaking of her spirit as if it were a scientific experiment. I flipped through the pages, seeing the names I had only ever known as numbers: Alina, Sophia, Maya, Sarah. Each entry followed the same terrifying pattern: the acquisition, the refinement, and finally the finalization. He hadn't just stolen their lives. He had studied their suffering to perfect the way he would trap the next one. By the time I reached my own section, labeled item number 7, the notes were even more aggressive. Janet shows a disturbing level of internal resilience. The current dosage is insufficient to break the core identity. Phase 9 must be accelerated. Phase 9 was the empty pedestal. Phase 9 was the glass coffin. I looked closer at the final page and saw a series of signatures from a private security firm and a high-end medical facility that didn't exist on any public registry. It was a network of monsters, a hidden industry built to serve the depraved whims of men like Elias. I heard the office door chime, the sound of the electronic lock being bypassed from the outside. He was here. He wasn't using the secret stairs. He was coming through the main entrance, and the heavy thud of his shoulder against the wood told me he had abandoned all pretense of elegance. I snatched the ledger and scanned the room for a hiding place, but there was nowhere to go. The only window was reinforced with steel bars, and the only exit was the door he was currently battering down. I looked at the silver engraving tool, then at the heavy brass paperweight on the desk, realizing that if I wanted to get this book to the world, I would have to survive the man who viewed my very existence as a line item in a budget of death. The heavy oak door didn't just open, it splintered inward under the weight of a man who had traded his humanity for the thrill of possession. Elias stepped into the office, his breathing heavy and jagged, a sharp contrast to the composed, cold billionaire I had married. His eyes immediately locked onto the ledger in my hands, and for a moment, the silence between us was more terrifying than the alarms wailing in the distance. He didn't look like a husband. He looked like a predator whose favorite toy had grown teeth. "Put it back, Janet," he said, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating growl that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You don't understand the value of what you're holding. You are destroying a decade of perfection for a momentary lapse in discipline." He took a step toward me, his hand reaching out not in a gesture of peace, but like a claw. I backed away until I felt the cold glass of the window against my spine, the heavy ledger pressed against my chest like a shield. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the hollow emptiness behind his eyes. He didn't care that the mansion was crumbling. He didn't care that the other women were rotting in their broken cases. He only cared that his item number 7 was no longer standing still. "I am not a statue, Elias," I whispered, my voice shaking but holding a strength I hadn't felt in years. "I am a witness, and every name in this book is a ghost that is going to haunt you until there is nothing left." His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, and he lunged across the desk, his fingers grazing my throat. I dodged his reach, the heavy brass paperweight from the desk coming down with a sickening thud against his shoulder. He roared, a sound that was less than human, and slammed his fist into the mahogany, sending a shower of splinters into the air. I scrambled toward the hidden staircase, the ledger tucked tightly under my arm, but he grabbed the hem of my torn dress, pulling me back with a force that sent me crashing to the floor. The silver engraving tool skittered across the carpet, just out of reach. As he towered over me, the red light of the emergency strobes making him look like a creature born of shadow and fire, I realized he wasn't going to take me back to the gallery. He was going to end the collection right here, on the office floor, and I would become a secret buried so deep that even the ghosts wouldn't find me. The floor beneath me felt like it was tilting as Ilya's shadow swallowed the light, his hand tightening on the fabric of my dress with a grip that felt like a tightening noose. I could see the reflection of the red emergency strobes in his eyes, a rhythmic, bloody pulse that signaled the end of my life as a living object and the beginning of my life as a corpse. He didn't speak. He just lined his weight into me, his knees pinning my spirit to the carpet while his other hand searched the desk for something, a letter opener, a heavy pen, anything to silence the witness I had become. I fought back with a primal, desperate energy, my nails clawing at his expensive shirt, tearing away the facade of the billionaire to reveal the sweating, panicked beast underneath. "You were supposed to be the jewel, Janet," he hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of the same bitter almonds as the gas in the vault. "You were supposed to be the one who stayed perfect forever." I felt my fingers brush against the cold metal of the silver engraving tool that had skittered nearby, and with a final, explosive surge of will, I drove the sharp point into the meat of his forearm. He howled, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second, long enough for me to twist away and scramble toward the center of the room. I didn't head for the door. I headed for the massive, floor-to-ceiling aquarium that divided his office from his bedroom, a tank filled with rare, predatory fish and lit by a delicate blue light that was now flickering in the power surge. I slammed the heavy brass paperweight against the thick acrylic glass, once, twice, 3 times, until the pressure of the thousands of gallons of water began to do the work for me. The glass groaned, a deep, crystalline sound of structural failure, and then it exploded. A wall of water, glass, and sand crashed into the room, a violent tide that swept Elias off his feet and slammed him against the mahogany desk. I grabbed the ledger from where it had fallen, shielding it with my body as the room flooded, the water swirling around my ankles and chest. In the chaos of the flood, the electronic locks on the balcony doors short-circuited and hissed open. I saw my chance. The freezing night air rushed in, smelling of rain and freedom. I didn't look back to see if Elias was rising from the wreckage. I sprinted onto the balcony, the ledger tucked into my waist, and looked down at the sheer drop into the rose gardens below. It was a leap into the unknown, but the darkness of the forest was nothing compared to the light of the man who wanted to turn me into a stone. The wind on the balcony was a cold blade that sliced through my wet clothes, a jarring reminder that I was still a living, breathing being with skin that could feel the bite of the night. Behind me, the office was a scene of watery carnage. The shattered aquarium had turned the sanctuary into a swamp of glass shards and gasping fish, with Elias struggling to find his footing in the rising flood. I stood on the edge of the stone railing, the heavy ledger of lost names pressed so hard against my ribs that it felt like a part of my own skeleton. Below me, the rose gardens were a sea of thorns and shadows, illuminated by the flickering orange glow of the engine room fires reflected in the mansion's high windows. I knew that the security perimeter was still active, the thermal cameras and the roaming hounds that Elias kept as his personal hunters, but the house was distracted by its own internal collapse. I looked back one last time and saw Elias emerge from the water, his face a distorted mask of hatred, his hand outstretched as he lunged toward the balcony. I didn't wait for his fingers to touch me. I inhaled a lungful of the freezing air and jumped, my body tumbling through the dark space between the gilded cage and the unforgiving earth. The impact with the rose bushes was a chaotic explosion of pain. The thorns tore at my arms and legs, but the thick foliage broke my fall just enough to keep me conscious. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of me, but the adrenaline was a fire in my veins that wouldn't let me stay down. I scrambled to my feet, my blood mixing with the mud of the garden, and sprinted toward the perimeter wall. I could hear the distant, high-pitched baying of the hounds. They had picked up the scent of my fear. I wasn't Auntie Janet the wife anymore. I was a hunted animal, but I was an animal that carried the truth in her hands. I found the drainage pipe that Sarah had mentioned in her journal, a narrow, rusted tunnel that led under the electrified fence and out toward the main road. As I crawled into the freezing, sludge-filled pipe, the sound of Elia's voice echoed from the balcony high above, screaming for his property to return. I kept moving through the filth, the ledger held high above the waterline, knowing that every inch I gained was a second of life stolen back from the man who thought he could own the wind. I emerged on the other side of the wall, shivering and broken, but as I looked at the distant lights of a passing car, I realized the hunt had only just begun. The road was a ribbon of wet asphalt that felt like ice beneath my bare, bleeding feet, but the biting cold was the only thing keeping the exhaustion from dragging me into the dirt. I stood in the tall grass by the roadside, my body trembling so violently I could hear my teeth chattering over the distant sound of the mansion's sirens. Every pair of headlights that rounded the curve felt like the searching eyes of Elias, looking to reclaim his lost property and bring me back to the pedestal that was still warm from the spotlights. I clutched the ledger under my shredded coat, the weight of those 6 dead women pressing against me, reminding me that I wasn't just running for my life, I was running for their memory. A battered sedan slowed down as it approached, the driver hesitant, and for a terrifying second, I considered hiding in the ditch. But the sound of the hounds was getting closer, their rhythmic barking echoing through the trees behind the estate walls. I stepped into the light, a ghost covered in mud, blood, and the remnants of a billionaire's dream, and waved my arms with the last of my strength. The car screeched to a halt, and an elderly man looked at me with a face full of confusion and horror. He didn't see a billionaire's wife, he saw a woman who had crawled out of hell. "Please," I rasped, my voice sounding like broken glass, "just drive. Don't look back at the lights on the hill. Just take me to the city." As he pulled away, I looked through the rear window and saw the Thorne estate silhouetted against the night sky, a pillar of smoke rising from the engine room where I had broken the heart of the machine. I knew Elias wouldn't call the police. He couldn't afford the questions. He would be using his private network, his recovery teams that operated in the shadows where the law couldn't reach. I opened the ledger to the back page and found the phone number Sarah had circled in red, a number for a journalist who had disappeared years ago while investigating the disappearing debutantes of the high society world. My fingers traced the digits as the car sped toward the flickering lights of the skyline. I was out of the house, but I was still in the gallery of his influence. The city was full of his friends, his lawyers, and his payroll, and I knew that the moment I stepped out of this car, I would be walking into a different kind of trap. I looked at the man driving and realized I didn't even know his name, yet he was the only thing standing between me and the item, status I had barely escaped. I had the evidence, but Elias Thorne had the world, and as we crossed the bridge into the city, I realized that the hardest part of the story wasn't surviving the mansion, it was surviving the truth. The city lights didn't feel like a welcome. They felt like 1,000 burning eyes, each one a potential camera linked back to Elia's central hub. As I stepped out of the old man's car and onto the damp pavement of a side street, the towering skyscrapers seemed to lean in, threatening to crush me under the weight of the corporate names etched in their glass, half of which were owned by the Thorne Group. I walked with my head down, my tattered coat pulled tight to hide the bloodstains and the heavy bulge of the ledger, feeling like a marked woman in a world that had been bought and paid for by my husband. I found a payphone in the back of a 24-hour diner, its metal casing cold and smelling of old rain, and dialed the number Sarah had left behind. Each ring was a hammer blow to my heart, a desperate pulse in the dark. When a woman's voice finally answered, sharp and guarded, I could barely find the air to speak. "I have the ledger," I whispered, the words catching in my throat as I watched a black SUV with tinted windows slow down at the intersection. "I am item number 7, and I have the names of the others." There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. "Meet me at the old clock tower in 20 minutes, she said, her voice dropping to a hiss. "If you see a black car, don't stop. If anyone calls your name, don't look back. Elias doesn't just own the house, Janet, he owns the streets. I hung up the phone and stepped back into the shadows, my heart racing as I realized that the city was just a larger version of the mansion. The same gold-plated influence that built my glass cage was now flowing through the fiber optic cables beneath my feet, searching for the anomaly in the system, searching for me. I began to move through the narrow alleys, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the facial recognition cameras hummed with predatory intent. Every siren in the distance felt like a personal threat. Every shadow that moved in a doorway looked like one of Elia's recovery agents. I reached the base of the clock tower, a crumbling brick monument to a time before billionaires could buy the silence of the dead, and waited in the darkness of the archway. I could feel the vibration of the city, a low, mechanical throb that reminded me of the engine room. I wasn't a wife, and I wasn't a statue. I was a glitch in Elias Thorne's perfect world, and I knew that the moment I handed over this book, the glitch would either become a revolution or a funeral. I saw a figure approaching from the fog, dressed in a long trench coat with a hat pulled low, and I gripped the silver engraving tool in my pocket, ready to find out if I had found an ally or if I had simply walked into the eighth cage. The figure in the trench coat stopped 10 feet away, their face a blur of shadows beneath the brim of a wide hat. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the drip of condensation from the old clock's rusted gears high above us. I stood paralyzed, my back against the cold brick, ready to bolt back into the labyrinth of alleys at the slightest hint of a weapon. "You're late, number 7, the woman whispered, and as she stepped into the weak amber glow of a street lamp, I saw the face of the journalist Sarah had trusted, a woman named Alina, whose own career had been dismantled by Elia's legal team years ago. She didn't look like a savior, she looked like a survivor, her eyes darting to the street corners with a practiced, twitching paranoia. I pulled the ledger from my coat, and the moment she saw the leather binding, she let out a breath that sounded like a sob. "He's been looking for this for a long time," she said, her hands trembling as she reached for the book. "He didn't just kill those women, Janet. He erased their families, their bank accounts, and their very existence from the public record. This book is the only proof that they were ever born." Just as my fingers let go of the ledger, a high-pitched electronic whine filled the air, the same sound the biometric watch had made in the mansion. A red laser dot appeared on the brickwork just inches from my head, dancing across the surface like a blood-red insect. "Run," Alina screamed, shoving the ledger into her bag as the first shot shattered the stone where I had been standing. We scrambled toward the narrow stairs of the clock tower, the iron steps groaning under our weight as we ascended into the darkness. Elia's recovery team wasn't using sirens or shouts. They were silent, efficient shadows moving with military precision through the plaza below. They didn't want a scene, they wanted a retrieval. I looked down through the slats of the wooden belfry and saw 3 black SUVs flanking the tower, their headlights cutting through the fog like the eyes of deep-sea monsters. We were trapped at the top of a dead-end monument, with the evidence in our hands and a fall that would surely be fatal. I looked at the massive, swinging pendulum of the clock, its rhythmic thud sounding like the heartbeat of the house I had escaped. I realized then that Elias wasn't coming for the book anymore. He was coming to ensure that the 7th item was permanently decommissioned before the first page could be scanned. Alina grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic light. "There's a radio transmitter at the top," she hissed over the sound of boots hitting the stairs below us. "If we can't get the book out, we broadcast the names. We make the city hear the ghosts." The iron staircase groaned under the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots, a sound that climbed toward us like a rising tide of iron. We reached the highest chamber of the clock tower, a skeletal room of massive brass cogs and grease-stained timber, where the air felt thin and smelled of ancient dust and ozone. Alina lunged toward a rusted terminal tucked behind the primary gear assembly, her fingers flying over a keyboard as she patched her laptop into the city's emergency broadcast frequency. a backdoor she had spent years preparing for this exact moment of desperation. There on the final landing, I whispered, my eyes fixed on the trapdoor that was beginning to rattle under the pressure of a crowbar. I looked at the ledger, the faces of the 6 women flashing in my mind like a reel of broken film, and I knew that the time for running had ended. Alina looked up, a grim smile cutting through her fear as the screen flickered to life. It's ready. Once I hit transmit, there's no taking it back. It will bypass the thorn firewalls and play on every digital billboard, every radio station, and every smart device within 10 miles. I grabbed the microphone, my hand shaking but my grip firm, and as the trapdoor splintered open to reveal the matte black helmets of Elia's strike team, I began to speak. I didn't scream, I spoke with the cold, hollow clarity of a woman who had already died once. I read the names, I read the dates, I read the chemical formulas of the treatments and the exact coordinates of the preservation suite hidden beneath the mansion's west wing. With every word, I felt the invisible threads that tied me to Elia's thorn begin to snap. The first agent stepped into the room, his suppressed rifle leveled at my chest, but he froze when he heard his employer's own voice, recorded on my phone months ago, describing the market value of a human soul. The broadcast was live. Across the city, the neon advertisements for Thorn luxury goods were replaced by the clinical medical records of item number 1. The silence of the night was shattered by the sound of 1,000 speakers echoing the truth that had been buried in the dark. Elias had wanted me to be his silent masterpiece, a statue that would never age and never speak, but in that moment I became a roar that shook the foundations of his world. The agent lowered his weapon, the red dot on my forehead vanishing as the comms in his ear exploded with panicked orders from a man whose empire was dissolving into a digital ghost story. I looked into the lens of the security camera in the corner, knowing Elias was watching, and I didn't look away. I was no longer a number in his ledger. I was the end of his collection, and the world was finally looking back. The atmosphere in the belfry shifted from a hunt to a funeral, as the gravity of the broadcast settled over the city like a thick, suffocating ash. Below us, the rhythm of the streets changed. The black SUVs didn't advance, they hesitated, their drivers receiving frantic, conflicting orders as the Thorn Group's stock plummeted in a digital heartbeat. I stood by the massive brass gears, watching the lead agent's mask reflect the flickering blue light of Alina's laptop, which was still screaming the truth into the ether. He didn't fire, he couldn't. To kill me now, in the middle of a live transmission witnessed by millions, would be to sign his own death warrant in a world that was suddenly, violently awake. I stepped toward the open edge of the tower, the wind whipping my hair across a face that no longer wore the mask of a submissive wife. In the distance, the Thorn mansion was a tiny, glowing ember on the hill, a fortress that had finally been breached by the one thing its walls couldn't stop. A voice, I felt a strange, hollow peace as I watched the city's digital billboards transform into a wall of evidence, the faces of the 6 forgotten wives staring back at the crowds like vengeful saints. Alina slammed the laptop shut, the transmission complete, and the silence that followed was heavier than the noise. "It's over, Janet," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of a decade-old debt finally paid. The world won't let him hide them anymore. But I knew Elias better than she did. A man who builds a gallery of the dead doesn't accept a life of public shame. He would rather burn the museum down with everyone inside it. I heard a new sound, the rhythmic, chopping beat of a private helicopter approaching from the north, its searchlight cutting through the fog like a predatory eye. It wasn't the police, it was Elias. He wasn't sending his men anymore. He was coming to oversee the final disposition of item number 7 himself. The searchlight hit the belfry, blinding us in a white-hot glare that smelled of aviation fuel and desperation. He was going to try to take me or kill me in the chaos of the city's shock, believing that even now his shadow was long enough to cover the sun. I gripped the iron railing, my knuckles white, and looked straight into the light, my heart no longer racing with fear, but with a cold, sharp hunger for justice. He wanted a masterpiece that would never change, but he was about to learn that the most dangerous thing in his collection wasn't the silence of the dead, it was the memory of the living. The helicopter hovered like a giant mechanical insect, the downdraft of its rotors threatening to throw us from the ledge of the clock tower. The white glare of the searchlight was so intense it stripped the world of color, turning the belfry into a bleached stage where the final act of this nightmare was about to play out. Through the swirling fog and grit, I saw the cabin door slide open, and there he was, Elias, harnessed to the frame, his face no longer that of a composed gentleman, but a raw, weeping wound of ego and madness. He didn't have a weapon, he had a handheld remote, a device linked to the emergency systems of the very tower we stood in. If I cannot have the perfection of your silence, Janet, then no one will have the memory of your face. He screamed over the roar of the engines, his voice a jagged edge of despair. He pressed a sequence on the remote, and beneath our feet, the ancient support beams of the clock tower groaned as the explosive bolts, installed years ago under the guise of structural reinforcement by a Thorne-owned company, began to detonate. The floor tilted violently, the massive brass cogs of the clock slipping from their tracks and crashing through the timber like falling stars. Elena scrambled for the stairwell, but I stayed, my eyes locked on Elias as the tower began its slow, agonizing lean toward the abyss. In that moment of total collapse, I realized he was still trying to curate the ending, to turn our deaths into a tragic, cinematic finale that he could control. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver engraving tool, the small, sharp instrument he had given me to mark my personal belongings. As the helicopter dipped low, trying to stabilize in the rising smoke, I didn't jump for safety. I lunged for the landing skid. My fingers caught the cold metal, the force of the movement jarring my teeth, and for a heartbeat, I was suspended between the crumbling history of the tower and the vibrating rot of the machine. I looked up at Elias, who was staring down at me in shock, and I used the tool to slice through the high-tension cable of his safety harness. The snap was a sound of ultimate liberation. As the tower gave way in a cloud of brick and dust, the helicopter lurched, and Elias was thrown into the empty air, his screams swallowed by the roar of the collapsing monument. I dropped into the safety of the lower roof just as the belfry vanished into the fog. I stood in the debris, the ledger still clutched in my hand, watching the city lights flicker and return to normal. The curator was gone, his gallery was in ruins, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't an item, a number, or a ghost. I was the one who walked away.